All right, welcome everybody to another edition of Garden Hour. I am joined this evening by Stephen Robertson and Hans Klopp. My name is Amanda Bachmann. I'm the SDSU Extension Urban Entomology Field Specialist based in Pierre, South Dakota. It is sunny and clear and very windy today in Pierre. I'm going to be talking to you guys about some insects that I've been seeing lately. But our featured speaker this evening is Stephen Robertson. He is our pesticide education field specialist based on campus in Brookings, South Dakota. And Stephen, what are you going to be talking about this evening?
Tonight I'm going to be talking about how to recognize pesticides, how to select them for your gardens, and how to use them appropriately and safely, as safely as possible.
Awesome. And for those of you who might be wondering about job titles, Stephen took over a job that I was doing for a very long time. So very excited to have Stephen on board, and I'm glad that he is going to be speaking to the Garden Hour audience this year. So always good to get somebody new on the roster. And Hans is our soil health field specialist. I think, sorry, I might have messed that one up, based in Watertown. And I know you're talking about soils tonight. So what is the topic you'll be covering?
You're correct. I want to talk about salinity slash sodicity and alkalinity and soil slash water.
Awesome. And as somebody who never took a soil science class, I am always excited to learn from you and from Anthony and from our other soil experts, because I know that salinity means salt, and that's about where my knowledge ends. Um, I will give you guys a few basics on this Zoom. We do have a Q&A at the bottom, so feel free if you've got a question for any of our panelists this evening or any other question, throw that in the Q&A. We will answer them live as we can at the end of each segment. This will be recorded, so you can see it again on YouTube. And if there's a question of yours that we don't get to, you can always call one of our garden hotlines or submit a question through Ask Extension on our problems and solutions page. Keep an eye out on the chat for some useful links and resources. And if you have a technical issue or need help, feel free to raise your hand and one of us will message you and try to assist you. So with that, I will turn it over to Stephen. Go ahead, share your screen, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Amanda. Really glad to be here. Glad to see everybody else here too. Thanks for showing up. It's really nice to be able to talk to people and not just my computer, which has happened before. So, yeah, my name is Stephen Robertson. I am the pesticide safety educator for the state of South Dakota. I basically operate all the education, the entire education portion of certification and recertification, which includes the examinations, the recertification courses, if you guys gone through any of those, the materials that are associated with the training itself, and some other materials, just handouts and stuff. Before I start this presentation, I need to make a disclaimer, and it is this: that any names of products or manufacturers that you see, that's not an endorsement for those products. They're just sometimes easier to get a hold of, especially when they are very commonly used. So that's why you'll see them, and I'll use them specifically in some ways to highlight things. But again, it's not an endorsement for that product, doesn't mean that it works well. I'm just here to talk about pesticides, their usage, and safety therein. All right. So first thing, I've got some objectives here, and it's always hard to kind of tease apart what it is that I want to cover. I've got 10 minutes, and there's a lot to cover. This is a huge range of things, and so it's kind of, you pick your audience and you choose the things that are going to be relevant. And for you guys, I'm hoping that I generated something relevant. But the first thing I really wanted to do for you is define what a pesticide is. And in doing so, I think you're going to start to recognize what pesticides are, even the ones that maybe don't seem that familiar or intuitively so. And I'll try to teach you how to understand labels, at least learn how to recognize where things are located, how to read through labels, and how to select the information that's going to benefit you and that are important to you. And then I'm going to teach you a little bit of how to select a pesticide. And my broad but big focus here is the safety therein. So I'll probably rush through just to get to that fifth objective. But let's start with the definition of a pesticide. Legally, it is any substance or mixture of substances intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest. So that's a pretty broad definition, but you guys are probably familiar with these ones. As you're talking about agricultural restricted use pesticides that are broadly put over crops in order to protect them from pest damage and loss of yield associated with pest problems. But It also includes some stuff that you use around the garden, backpack sprayer, spraying out any sort of chemical into a lawn to control weeds, such as Roundup. That's going to be also a pesticide. Your raid, of course, that's something that I probably use this every year. I have entire colonies of these things under my awnings on my roof, and it takes a lot to kill them. I go through like 20 cans of that. And then here, these are something that you probably used inside the house. They're pretty common. You get your liquid taro baits. It's an ant bait. It's very good at collapsing the colony or killing the colony and preventing those sugar ants or odorous house ants from getting into the house. And then your roach traps, which I've used my entire life. Thank you, Mom. But there are a lot of things that you probably don't recognize. Yes, in fact, Lysol, some disinfectant spray, or Febreze, a deodorant, an antibacterial, disinfecting wipes. We even got things that go into your laundry and clean your toilet bowl, and paint that is put on walls. These are pesticide products that are currently registered in the state of South Dakota, and also have registrations to the EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency. So there are maybe some household items that you probably didn't recognize as registered or qualifying as a pesticide. And these things do qualify because they were made intentionally to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate a pest. Now let's move on to labels. Labels are the single most important source of information that you can have when it comes to pesticides. There's such a huge array of pesticides out there that I can't give you everything that you need to know about every pesticide. What I can tell you is that that information is located on the label. Knowing how to navigate that label, find that information, and then make a selection based on the information available to you is going to be your most useful tool when it comes to using pesticides. And so I'm going to cover some EPA requirements for labels, the structure of labels, general. This isn't something that's set in stone for everything, every item that needs to be on there, but it is pretty consistent across labels. And then I'll cover some instructions, requirements, and restrictions for basically covering yourself, making sure you're doing it in a safe way, and where to find that information. It's important to say that a label is enforceable. This quote up here at the top that was on the previous slide, this is something that is on every label, and this essentially says you are responsible for reading this label, knowing what it says, and only acting in the way that it is specified in the label. If you did so inconsistent with that label, it turns out it's unlawful. So make sure that you're doing so. Front label, the front panel. This is going to be slapped on that front part of the panel, or the front part of the item itself. In most cases for you guys, it's going to be purchased from the shelf. And so it's going to be the thing that they put in the front. So the first thing you're going to see, definitely the biggest thing, is going to be your product, your brand, or your trademark up here at the top. For this one, it's Weed Done LV4EC. This is a 2,4-D product, so something that would be used probably around the household, but not in the concentrations. What we're looking at here is a label for, again, an agricultural herbicide, but something that you could use around the house if you had access to it. In any case, move on. Here's some active ingredients. This is important. 2,4-D. This is 2,4-dichlorophenoxacetic acid. Isocotyl ester. Now that's a lot of words, or isooctyl ester. It's a lot of words. 2,4-D, that's the abbreviated name. Keep out of reach statement has to be on this front part, so you'll always see this KUROC statement here. And you'll always see a signal word. The signal word indicates the toxicity level. There's various toxicity levels. We've got 4. And they basically refer to how much of a substance is required to cause permanent damage. And it also considers the route of entry. Your most vulnerable parts are going to be inside your mouth. So if you swallow something, you're probably going to absorb a lot. If you get something in your eye, it's going to damage your vision. So these are going to be the considerations of routes of entry and toxicity level. First aid is only required on the front panel for toxicity category 1. That would be indicated with danger, poison, and colon crossbones. And then oftentimes it's got net contents. This is just a sample label, so there are no net contents here. This would be put onto a container itself, and that container would dictate the net contents, which is not going to be present on this one. Some other things that you need to look for, and this presentation is going to be available to you. So at any time, if you guys need to go back through this, but by all means do so. EPA registration number down here. This is a good solid link to the manufacturer, and it also links other things in the process. So downstream, it's a way to track things, and it's really important to be able to recognize where things are coming from. Company name and address. They're definitely not going to sell you short on that. This is New Farm. They've got it in 3 different places just on this front part, our front panel, and they've got their address here. Mode of action. This is important really for pesticide or for resistance management, something that you guys don't really need to worry about, I don't think, in gardens. But anytime you see this, it's basically giving you an idea of how it acts, how it kills, or how it repels the organism in question. First aid statement, it has to be somewhere in the label. It doesn't have to be on the front panel, but you can see here it's on the front panel. In fact, this is a critical piece of information. Do not forget it. Do not lose it. Find it and make sure that you can reference it whenever you need. It could save somebody's life. Some formulation information. We don't need to cover that. General target use information. This is going to be pretty well specified on this front panel. Broadleaf herbicide, a selective weed killer. Group 4 herbicides. We know it's an herbicide. We read a little bit further. Many broadleaf weeds and brush control in, and it gives you a list of things that you can use it in. That's going to be important, but we'll look at it a little bit later. And some exposure contact information, some emergency contacts. Really good information to have around just in case something were to happen if you were using a pesticide. The rest of the label, precautionary statements, this is where you really want to get to. So once you get to the precautionary statements, make sure you're reading through, is it something that's going to be useful in the area that you're in? This is one of the places that you're going to find it. It'll be down under environmental hazards, hazards to humans and domestic animals. Do you have pets around? Can you use it, and is it going to kill your dog if you put it on your lawn? In most cases, again, the products you're going to be using are probably going to be okay, but make sure you read through the labels so that you're 100% sure that it's not going to hurt one of your best friends. If I killed my dog when I was doing a pesticide application, I would never apply pesticides ever again. It also specifies personal protective equipment, and this is something that I'm going to get to here at the end. But long sleeve shirts, shoes, socks, protective eyewear, chemical resistant gloves, and chemical resistant apron. These are non-negotiable. These are things that you have to wear when you're doing these things. All mixers, loaders, applicators, flaggers, and other handlers must wear. And so the language in these labels is really important too. So it's legally enforceable. And when you see things like must versus something that says should is a recommendation. It doesn't mean that lawfully you have to do it. But when you see words like must, make sure you're adhering to that label specification. Then you'll get down further along. Make sure you look at environmental hazards, like I already mentioned, and directions for use. Notice down here, here is that quote that I've been saying to you. It is a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. Labeling refers not just to the label that I'm presenting to you now, but all informational resources that are available to you from the manufacturer and is specified in the label. And so sometimes you'll see refer to this for further details, and it'll be a website. You have to have access to that website in order to read the rest of that label. And there's often very important information. So don't stop short of just reading the label that's present. It's all labeling. And it may specify very specific conditions that apply to you. So be sure, read through the label, make sure it applies to you, that you're okay to use it given your specific situation. The rest of the label, some restrictions, application instructions. There's some really important stuff in here. Definitely read it before you apply. It's really good to read these before you buy, before you apply, before you handle, which would come before you apply, before you mix, and before you store and before you dispose. Lots of times that you should be reading through this to find really important information that'll be relevant for your specific action. Selection and safety. Let's go ahead and get a move on here. The safest pesticide that you guys could use is just none at all. If it's a small area, get out there and hand pick, get out there and do something simple. Don't get the idea and don't do, these home mixes of, gosh, I've seen something more recently like boiling water, vinegar, and soap. This is probably not going to have the effect that you're looking for, and it's going to smell up your house. So be cautious not only about the way you approach it, just pesticides in general, but also what you're using. If you've got the option, just go out there and pluck it with your hands. Um, Selection of pesticide requires a little bit of knowledge, right? So you have to know the pesticide itself, got to know a little bit about that, but you have to know the pest, when to apply, when is it going to be effective, what does the pest look like, how do you know you've identified it as the correct thing? And safety is top priority. No matter what you guys are doing when it comes to using pesticides, safety. Be safe about it. When you're using even that wasp spray, if it tells you to wear gloves, it does. Wear those gloves. Protective eyewear. Really important stuff. So something in the previous label, and this is directly from the previous label. You can see the weeds list. This is identifying the weeds that it's labeled for. If you treat something that is not on this label, you are actually off label. So make sure that the actual pest that you're treating for specified. Here we've got beggar ticks. You probably had no idea what this is. I have no idea what these I had hawkweed, orange hawkweed. I've never seen these before. And so when you're dealing with a pest, that's the critical important part of being able to identify it. That's where everything starts. Once you have an identity, then you can figure out how to control it, how you can manage it, how you can mitigate those problems with that pest. And then pesticide selection proceeds with label information. So once you have the identity, then you can get into the pesticides itself, seeing what items are labeled for that and how to get there. And if I should go back real quick here, these two sites down here, you can find all products that are available to treat for specific pests at this Kelly Products. It's a really good site. And then the South Dakota government or product search, that one has everything that's currently registered in the state of South Dakota, but it doesn't give you some information that could be helpful. Kelly Solutions is a really good site for that. Some personal protective equipment. This is pulled directly from that label. Again, I read it to you already. These are the things that you have to wear. This is kind of what it would look like if you wore those things, minus the respirator and minus perhaps that waterproof hat. But it's really good to kind of overdo it even. You just don't want to be exposed to something that is going to potentially cause problems in the immediate or long-term period. And make sure you're protecting your hot spots, as the University of Nebraska puts it. That would be places that are really absorptive on your skin, and so your palms are pretty absorptive, are pretty protected. Your forehead is not. So every time you wipe your head and you apply that pesticide, a lot of it's getting absorbed. If you use the restroom, you have to wash your hands. Wash your hands before you touch yourself. You can see down here the genital area, the absorption rate is 100%. And I can tell you that I have used insect spray down in that area, and it does not feel good. So if recognizing this picture and saying, okay, don't put it there, hopefully something else would happen. Don't expose yourself in that area. Protect yourself as much as you can. Remove gloves, wash your hands, wash your face, wash everything before you handle yourself. Here's some examples of things. Not everything works the same. This huge Teflon suit's really good for all things. It's pretty resistant to all chemicals. And so this is a good, safe bet. Unfortunately, it's pretty hot. It covers everything. And sure, maybe you don't want to wear that all the time, but it is a good option at all times. These are some masks that you might wear in the very extreme case. You know, you got a full respirator that's putting oxygen and other air into your mask so you can breathe, but it's otherwise impermeable to gases. These are pants. This is, of course, Teflon pants. These are polyester pants. They tend to be a little bit less absorptive when it comes to some of these products. It depends on what it is. Make sure you read the label. And jeans. Jeans are made of cotton. They're super absorptive. Any insecticide or pesticide that you're using is just going to get soaked up in those jeans. And they've done some studies to show once you toss them into the wash, if you're tossing them in with other clothes, guess what? It's transferring all of that stuff to other clothes. So the selection of pesticide, PPE or pesticide protective gear is really important. How you wash it is really important, and what you do with it afterwards is going to be important. Either if you dry it in your dryer, there's a possibility you're transferring more. Outside seems to be doing better, so maybe just toss your pesticide laden clothes after you wash them outside to dry. And gloves themselves. Again, we're talking about permeability. These are going to be the names of what gloves you need for each pesticide are going to be specified. So your barrier laminate gloves are some of the more intense ones. So some of your higher toxic or greater toxic compounds, and then some things that have strong permeability. Some of your fossil fuel carriers and some of your solvents might just eat through some of your gloves. Barrier linen's really important. And use restrictions and precautions. You can't use pesticides anywhere. If this guy is spraying this tree specifically, do not get out into your garden and spray a tree. Everything that you spray upwards is going to come back down on you. So unless you full gear, full respirator, gloves, Teflon soup, you've got everything, and there is no way for it to get inside. Okay, but to me, this looks very dumb and very dangerous. So I would suggest not doing that at all. There's no reason. The only time, when you spray up, and if you guys have used that wasp spray, they get up sometimes underneath these awnings, right? You got to spray up. Do it at an angle, and it tells you to do so on the bottle. Do so at an angle and wear eyewear so it's not falling back and potentially hurting your vision or hurting your eyes. Um, and recognize your environmental conditions as you're walking around. If you're spraying the edge of your house, or you happen to be in your garden here and you're spraying here, looks like this poor guy's killed this whatever this was. Maybe he shouldn't have done that. But you get to a corner and you're spraying down. Well, it's just going to blow back. So make sure that you're paying attention to where you're spraying, watching out for blowbacks, watching out for changes of wind. If you're in a tight area, sure, there may not be much wind, but when that wind gust comes, where's it going to blow? Is it going to blow back on you? Make sure you're aware and familiar with your surroundings. For that label that I've been using, it says do not use near or in a greenhouse. Of course, that's partly because of the susceptible plants, but also because of an enclosed space. So make sure you're paying attention to enclosed spaces as well. Wind changes. We're in South Dakota. If you guys don't know wind, well, then you don't live in South Dakota that I know. But winds change pretty dramatically and they can pick up really fast. So make sure you're familiar with what's going on. It's good for drift control, which is something that absolutely has to be done whenever you use these compounds. Again, label is the law. And if you use it in any way that's not specified by the label, you're actually doing it illegally. And use your brain, have an idea. I mean, some of these things seem intuitive, but when you're out there, just make sure you're thinking of all the angles. What could possibly go wrong? Could you trip over something and fall into a pesticide that you just put down? I know that sounds strange, but make sure you're keeping these things in mind. It'll keep you safe and it'll keep those around you safe and it'll keep your environment safe. These are our civil rights slides, both in English and in Spanish. And here's me with my bun and my contact information. So I'll leave that up now for now, Amanda, if you'd like me to, or I can stop sharing now.
Um, if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw those in the Q&A. There was a question in the chat about a website from a label. I'm not sure some of the resources you shared, if you want to like drop some links in the chat while Hans is doing his presentation so folks can maybe copy those or catch them on the chat recording.
Sure. I think what you're referring to is potential other labeling information. Just make sure you go through that label, look for things that say something along the lines of find more information here, and then that'll be on the label. There is no additional labeling in the label that I presented today, but there are labels out there that have that. So make sure you're looking out for additional resources.
Yeah, I'll say that a lot of homeowner products probably don't have additional online labels. That would really only be for like some of the restricted use things that if you're just, treating your lawn or whatever yourself, you're not going to be running into.
Yeah, a lot of it would be so if something changed mid-season or the EPA decided, well, you need to have this extra bit on there, it's something they would tack on. Or if it comes out they did a little bit more research and got some very specific information. Yes, but you're right. You're not probably going to find those on a lot of your over-the-counter end-use products that you guys are going to be using.
It can be good to Google a label because then you can a lot of times just download the PDF. So if the print on the bottle is like really tiny, you can get that PDF and then you're able to zoom in on the text to maybe be able to read it a little bit easier at home. So the electronic
And
copies are never a bad idea.
and the EPA has copies of all labels. So you can always look up, remember that EPA registration number, type in that registration number, type in EPA, type in label, and you'll be able to find that label.
Yep. Awesome. Well, if folks have other questions for Stephen, he'll be sticking around, so throw those in the Q&A. But with that, you can go ahead and stop sharing, and Hans will throw his presentation up there, and we'll learn about salinity.
So today I'm going to talk about salinity in gardens. And when most people think of salt, they probably think of the container of salt I have on pictured on the right side of my screen. So most people probably think of salt as sodium chloride, which is general table salt. But really the term salt is basically just any evaporite compounds of different elements that exist, or elemental compounds, I guess you would call them. So common types, common cations that make up salts, which are positively charged, are calcium, sodium, magnesium, and potassium. And common anions that make up salt in soil and or groundwaters are chloride, sulfate, nitrate, bicarbonate, and carbonate. And some common forms of salts are halite, which is a mineral form of table salt. Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate. Glauber salt is sodium sulfate. Calcite is calcium carbonate. But calcite is really not all that soluble, but it is very common in soils. And sometimes if you have a very white appearing soil that's been watered a lot, it's probably really white colored because of calcite. And there's also horizons in the soil where calcite is deposited through geological processes, which are very common in South Dakota. And gypsum is another calcium salt. And calcium chloride is probably not that commonly found in soils, but it's a very commonly bought salt and used as road salt. Sylvite is a mineral form of potassium chloride. It's very commonly used as a potassium fertilizer. And baking soda I put on here, which is sodium bicarbonate. And I know some people add that to their gardens. I would not suggest doing that unless you have a really acidic garden, because adding sodium to the soil isn't very good for it. But that's up to you. So salts in soil come from geologic parent materials. So whatever materials were deposited in the areas, depending on like if they were in an old ocean basin or evaporite basins, or if they come from rocks that were formed in those type of materials. And in a lot of eastern part of South Dakota, most of the parent materials have been brought down by glaciers. So the salts in those parent materials are from geologic parent materials that were north of here and brought down by the glacier. But the ones in the western part, West River, where it's not glaciated, where a lot of the salts there are in shale, which is a sedimentary rock that formed in saltwater areas. Pretty much every fertilizer is technically a salt, although there's different elements. If you add them, they can increase the amount concentration of different things in the soil. And as I mentioned, like potassium and nitrate were salts, which also are very important fertilizers. Organic fertilizers have them because in manures, there's essentially broke down plant materials, which add some salt, and urine from livestock adds some salt to them. And as your compost breaks down, there's salt you add to your food, and then from decomposing the food, there gets to be some salinity. Probably the issue in horticulture with salt that causes salt is just irrigation waters people choose. And as you add more water to the soil, you add more salt to the soil, especially if there's not low salinity water to flush it out. And shallow groundwaters that are close to the soil surface can move upward via capillary rise and bring some salts to the surface. And why soil salinity is important? Too high of salinity level in the soil can reduce plant growth and soil microbial activities. And too much of certain salts in the soil can create toxicities for plants and reduce uptake of essential plant nutrients. And it's not necessarily just the effect of just having too much sodium or too much chloride, which are bad for plants if they take up too much. But if you have a lot of bicarbonate and carbonate in the solution, you generally have a high pH, which if you look at the availability of plant nutrients versus pH, a lot of the plant nutrients are not the most available at high pH levels. But many of the common salts you find in the soil or irrigation water also are in the forms that plants can take up, such as potassium 2+, calcium 2+, magnesium 2+, nitrate, and sulfate. And those are those are 5 of the 6 most needed elements from the soil from plants, and they're all essentially parts of common salts in irrigation water and soil too. And if you have too much of your soil solution or the exchangeable cations which are on the absorbed to soil clays and organic matter, it can lead to the organization of your soil falling up, just breaking down and having really poor soil structure. And then you have poor infiltration in your soil, and your soil is usually really hard, and it just has very low productivity if you have a condition called sodicity. And here are some salinity term. I guess I just have it as salinity level, which is just basically the level of salts that are present in the soil, or amount of salt that would be present in a saturated soil or in the water that you have. And this is commonly measured by electrical conductivity, or just the total dissolved solids, or the total amount of dissolved compounds in the soil. Sodicity is an indication of the level of sodium present in the soil and or water. They usually use sodium absorption ratio in irrigation water and soil water, which is the ratio of sodium to calcium plus magnesium, or exchangeable sodium percentage if you measure the absorbed elements on soil clays and organic matter. And essentially, if you have a high ratio of sodium to calcium plus magnesium in the water, you increase exchange of sodium for calcium and magnesium on soil cation exchange sites on clays and organic matter, and that it increases how much exchangeable sodium there is on the clays, and then it usually causes degradation to occur to soil structure, especially in soils with a lot of clay in them, which is very common in South Dakota. And essentially, a lot of people probably misplace all these 3 salinity terms. Alkalinity is basically just the ability of the soil to buffer against acidic solutions. And this is dictated by the amount of hydroxide, which when most people think of a base, they think of hydroxide. And bicarbonate and carbonate also can increase the pH of water. So essentially, alkalinity is just the ability of the solution to buffer against acidic solutions. But if you have a pH of your soil or water higher than 8.5, you likely are getting some of the salts. You likely have a lot of sodium and carbonate present, because calcite will dissolve to a pH of like 8.1 to 8.5, I think. But if it's higher than that, you're probably getting the salts from the alkalinity from either potassium or sodium carbonate in the solution. So if you have high alkalinity, you usually have a very high pH. So if you refer to something as alkaline, it usually probably has a pH of 8 or higher. And a lot of the waters in South Dakota, irrigation waters and surface water, have high alkalinity. And here's classification of salt affected soils. So if your saturated paste extract EC, which is basically you take soil, you mix it to the consistency of a concrete mixer, and then you extract the water from it from a vacuum filter, and then you stick a probe in it that measures how well electricity moves through it. If it's less than 4 decisiemens per meter, it is not salt affected, and if it has a low sodium absorption ratio and a pH less than 8.5, if it has a high electrical conductivity higher than 4 decisiemens per meter, but the SAR is actually 13 and not 15. I forgot to correct this in this. That's my mistake, but it's the exchangeable sodium percentage of 15, or SAR 13. That's the border. And if it's sodic, it has a low electrical conductivity and high sodium absorption ratio and a high pH. And if it's saline sodic, it generally has a lot of salinity and sodicity, but it doesn't have a pH greater than 8.5, although it can have a pH of like 8.5. And here's a diagram from a publication that Rhoda Burrows did on the salinity tolerance of different vegetables. And some vegetables like beets or asparagus are more tolerant to salinity because the 0% ECE is which is what I said that was a classification for salinity on the previous one was 4. So a lot of you start seeing a yield loss below 4 decisiemens per meter in many of the horticultural crops that you would grow in South Dakota. And some drop off really quick, where other ones really slowly decrease as the electrical conductivity saturated paste extract or ECE increases. And like some crops like peas are really sensitive, peas and beans are really sensitive to the salinity level of the water. And usually when you have a routine soil analysis done on your soils, they don't actually measure the saturated paste extract EC. They measure an EC 1-to-1, which is where you take like 10 grams of soil and 10 grams of deionized water and you mix it together, and then usually stick a pH probe and an electrical conductivity probe in it, and it'll give you the 1-to-1 EC and saturated, the 1-to-1 EC and 1-to-1 pH value. So those values are usually about half the level of what the ECE is, although it depends some on soil texture and types of clays present. But you can see here for the ECEs, although some of these are field crops and not horticultural crops, like tomatoes will start to have a yield decrease at an ECE of 2.5, but then an EC 1-to-1 of 1.4 to 1.8. So if you have a EC 1-to-1 of less than 1, you probably don't have an issue when growing most vegetable crops. But if you have one higher, you're more likely to see issues with different vegetable crops. And to manage soil salinity, the first thing I would do is, if you're going to irrigate your plants a lot, or if you have a high tunnel or greenhouse, I would have the electrical conductivity and pH or an irrigation analysis measured on your sample. And there's a bunch of laboratories that you could send your sample to have that's measured on, and that will measure the concentration of many of the salts I previously mentioned at the start of this slide, including sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Hardness is another indication of how much alkalinity or calcium carbonate there is in the water, and nitrate, sulfate, chloride, carbonate, and bicarbonates. So those are commonly measured in those. And then you can use that to calculate the sodium absorption ratio to get the ratio of sodium to calcium plus magnesium that is present in your water. And don't excessively water your plants if you don't have to, because if you have a container where it isn't draining out, you will build up your salts a lot faster as you add more of them. And if you have a container where they will drain, you want to make sure that water can drain through them and it just won't all build up in them. But you'll also will lose fertilizer you add, like nitrate and sulfate from sulfur and nitrogen fertilizers that you add if you flush a lot of water through them. And based on your irrigation water analysis, just do not use waters that are likely to cause sodicity. And like I previously said, an SAR of 13 is where they categorize it as being sodic. Some more recent papers have found an SAR as low as 6 will cause issues with soil structure, especially in soils like that are found in South Dakota. And don't use waters with high electrical conductivity, because you'll have reduced yield and you'll have salt buildup. And another thing you could do is harvest rainwater that's low in EC, because the only salts from it are from ones that are deposited up in the atmosphere, and it has much lower salinity. And if you have an outdoor garden, if you do use a moderate amount of water, there's usually enough rainwater to keep the salts flushing downward in it, unless you have a really poorly drained soil. So here's my contact information if you have any more questions. And I'm going to write a more in-depth article on this, in which I should have up within the next month or so.
Awesome. Thank you, Hans. If folks have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A. I know Stephen's been in the Q&A answering a couple questions that folks have had that were related to pesticides, so awesome work there. But we will go ahead and I'll jump into my section on some bug stuff.
Well, did she just say, or are some plants more than susceptible than others? I think I answered that question if that was referring to salinity in the presentation.
I think it was actually referring to pesticides or plants being susceptible to different chemicals.
Oh,
It was a follow-up. She had a question right above that.
okay.
All right, let me get my screen up. Cool. Okay. So I wanted to touch on some, breaking insect issues that folks might have been noticing in their gardens or yards this time of year. The Western bean cutworm moths are out in force. I notice these little guys every year because they'll be flying early in the morning and they'll set off the cameras on my house. And then they'll get inside and my cats really enjoy hunting them down and eating them. So if you've seen a whole bunch of these slightly fancy-ish, 1 inch long brown moths with some funky patterns on their wings, Western bean cutworms, the moths, you don't really have to worry too much about them. They will be some good snack food for the robins in that they're not the strongest flyers. But if you've seen a lot of moths, this is probably what they are. And then every year, grasshoppers are like the thing in South Dakota. And this year is kind of shaping up to be no different. We have had a lot of rain throughout a decent portion of South Dakota, so a lot of our road ditches are still pretty lush. A lot of the pastures are still really green, but the grasshoppers, the eggs have hatched, the nymphs are developing, and if you're seeing a lot of them, it is easier to manage them when they are small versus when they get to be big. Uh, Grasshoppers are sort of generalist defoliators. They can be a real problem on edges of gardens as they sort of move in from like road ditch areas. So if you are in a more sort of like rural gardening location and you've had issues with grasshoppers in the past, absolutely start scouting now. Maybe consider doing some perimeter treatments. Maybe borrow a friend's chicken tractor and let the chickens, sort of go around and take out some of those grasshoppers before they get into your garden. But now is the time to be keeping an eye out for them because they are starting to hatch or have already hatched. And we do have a couple of articles up on our extension website. I put a link there to one of the ones from last year about grasshoppers and tomatoes, but it does kind of apply to all garden produce. And then just an insect that has kind of crossed my radar. A friend found one in her house and was worried that it was one of the pest cockroach species. But the Pennsylvania wood cockroach is pretty common across South Dakota, especially in areas where people are keeping, firewood or, have a lot of trees. As the name implies, they do enjoy wooded areas. um, we're not super creative when it comes to naming insects as entomologists. But these are a fairly large-ish roach, and I don't get a ton of cockroach questions in South Dakota. So when people do see these, they tend to be pretty alarmed. They will find their way indoors just as sort of on accident. They don't want to be inside. This is not a cockroach species that feeds or reproduces indoors. So if you're bringing in firewood or lumber, like especially, in the fall as we're, preparing for like wood stove season or something like that, or fireplace season, that's when you might, accidentally bring some of these guys inside. This time of year, maybe they just hitchhiked in or were able to find their way in through a bathroom vent. But if you've got any sort of wood piles, you might have noticed these cockroaches outside. Don't be alarmed. They're absolutely supposed to be outside. They help with decomposing wood. They're not something that you need to worry about managing, but because they are a cockroach and the males are, about 2 inches long and have big wings, people can kind of sort of easily confuse them with some of our pest cockroach species. So just know, see a cockroach outside, odds are really good it's one of the Pennsylvania wood cockroaches, and you don't need to be worried about it. And the one that is pictured on my hand here spent pretty much all day in my watering can. And when I was finally able to fish him out, he was actually still alive. Like, I don't know if he made it, but man, cockroaches are tough insects. And I did want to put up this picture of some of the annuals I have in my yard. And I talked the last time I was on Garden Hour about using annuals for pollinators. The study that was posted on Entomology today, looking at some of the different cultivars and which ones were sort of most attractive to pollinators. Well, as long as you've got something blooming in your yard, annual, perennial, either way, hopefully the pollinators will find it. And I just wanted to show this picture of a clearwing moth, genus Himeris. It was really cute, maybe only about an inch long, real chunky body. You can see it's sort of one of the bumblebee mimics, so it's kind of trying to pretend to be a bee so that the birds don't try to eat it. But I absolutely, you know, dropped my bag of groceries and, stopped to take a picture of this little dude because it was just so adorable and, using the annuals like I talked about the last time. So that was pretty exciting to see. And that's your sort of like, interesting, pretty adorable insect chaser for the next slide, where I'm going to be talking about ticks. So the South Dakota Department of Health has a tick information page that also includes a tick survey. So if you are out hiking or just recreating or otherwise pick up a tick in South Dakota, um, help contribute to some community science and fill out the survey at Department of Health. After you've safely removed the tick or captured it, take a picture of it. There is a place for you to upload your picture so they can get an idea of what species are present, where and when in the state. Obviously, our main three there are the American dog tick, which I've talked about before, is, widespread across the state and is pretty common. Lone Star tick is the one that we're really keeping an eye on as it moves into South Dakota, because that is the one that can vector the alpha-gal protein that makes people allergic to red meat. So if you are a steak lover, you want to be real careful with your tick protection so that you don't, end up with a Lone Star. And then our black-legged tick, formerly known as the deer tick, this one is in eastern South Dakota, and I had a sample come in from Pierre from La Fram that was a black-legged tick. So I was bummed out to see that one. I really thought I'd escaped those. But black-legged ticks are the ones that vector Lyme disease, which is a really big deal. So as you're out and about this summer, make sure that you're using a repellent with an EPA-approved active ingredient. Put on the long sleeves, the long pants. And if you do happen to find a tick on you, remove it, take a picture of it, and submit the survey to Department of Health, because that's going to really help us come up with some better, tick management and public health messaging and just general tick, avoidance, health and safety here in South Dakota. I did want to throw out a couple of upcoming insect events. They're a little bit ways out, but depending on where you are in South Dakota, if you're interested in traveling, we will be having Little Wings on the Prairie on July 20th. It's a Saturday. It'll be a Saturday morning at Owyhee Downstream Recreation Area here in Fort Pierre. Always a good time. This is our 10th year of the event, so we'd love to see a bunch of people out there. It's a great place to pick up some of my entomology publications so that I can stop storing them in my office and getting them into the hands of people who can use them. And then we kind of close our season out with Insect Fest. So I'm sure I will mention it later in the Garden Hour series, but Insect Fest at McCrory Gardens, if you're someone who's really into bugs, highly encourage you to come on out, bring the kids, bring the grandkids. It's a family-friendly event. And that'll be on Saturday, September 7th. So with that, I will go ahead and stop sharing and take a look at where we are on the Q&A. It looks like our Q&A got cleared up pretty well. So awesome work on my panelists' part here, especially Stephen, getting some of that pesticide education out there. If folks have additional questions, feel free to throw those in the Q&A right now. And if you think of a question after garden hour, you can always go to our problems and solutions page on the SDSU Extension website under Gardens. And you can submit your question there, either to the garden hotline or through the Ask Extension widget. Sometimes stuff that comes through Ask Extension, we pull for future garden hour episodes, or I know Dr. Ball looks at that for some of his tree pest alert information. So there's lots of places that you can find us if you didn't catch us live this week to ask your question. But with that, I'll kind of go around and maybe see what our panelists are going to be up to garden-wise through the next month of June. So yeah, Stephen, I know pesticide education is your day job now, but what is going on in your garden that you are most excited about this year?
In my personal garden?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. So I live in Brookings. I've always been somebody that's like kind of wanted to grow, but I kind of grew up in cities, and so I didn't really have land anyway or property to be able to do stuff. Moved here. We've got 2 plots out at the local garden, and let's see, we're growing peas, beans. Peas are new this year. We're going to try some peas. So listen to Hans talk about how they were potentially affected by salinity. Thanks Hans for that. Peas, grow up like a large number of tomatoes. I think we've got 8 plants out there, and then a few at home. Some cherries here at the house in order to have that snack at home. But BLTs are definitely on the menu. And we got beans, we've got carrots, we've got onions, we've got cabbages, we've got kale, we've got broccolini. We're doing cantaloupe this year, honeydew melon. We're really excited about honeydew melon and watermelon and pumpkin. And then we've got herbs at the house and other flowers at the house. So a lot. We're doing probably more than we should, but it's
I was
fun.
gonna
So
say, like, that sounds like so much. I'm like, I've got like 10 tomato plants out there, and like a watermelon plant. And I'm like, all right.
we've got really into it. We like to can, we like to preserve, we like a lot of stuff, and so over the winter months we like to dip into all that hard work in the summer. So it's been awesome. I really enjoy it, and it's getting more and more. And there's going to come a point where I just have to quit and like spend full time as a producer. That's where it's going. So
Well, that's awesome. I look forward to seeing some updates, and maybe you should just plan ahead and like put some stuff in the state fair this year. Um,
oh,
throw some
you're
entries
always
in.
welcome, Amanda, to stop by and pick up some fresh produce. It's only
To
a
say,
3 hour trip.
I know, right? I mean, yeah, I come through Brookings all the time. And let's see, Hans, any garden tips, last minute messages about salinity for
No,
folks
no.
before we head out?
I I like I was telling you when we were talking yesterday that my community garden in Watertown's very weedy, and it definitely does not look pretty. I'm trying to grow quite a few things though, because I'm trying to grow popcorn for the first time, but I think it might not pollinate right because I have sweet corn not that far from it. But I don't know if
Oh.
it actually has pollination issues or not. But
Yeah, I've never grown popcorn. I've only ever grown sweet corn on like a field research scale. I've never tried that one in like my backyard garden. So that's an awesome experiment, and I look forward to fingers crossed for you that it works out.
the,
And maybe Rhoda or Christine will be able to hop on a
to
quick
help.
call at some point and give you some insider tips.
No, I'm just very curious, and I have a bunch of other vegetables I'm growing too. So we'll see what I end up getting though.
Well, that is awesome. It's I like to live vicariously through other people's gardens. I do have one of my own, but I focus mainly on tomatoes and basil, and I save the like pumpkins and the winter squashes for, supporting the local farmers market and the people who've got some more room to grow those things. But
Yeah, I always grew a lot of them growing up because we had an area where we have a big area to grow them.
yeah, yeah, you need some space. Oh, and we've got a comment in the chat from someone who's grown popcorn. She said that popcorn usually pollinates later than sweet corn, so you might be okay. So there you go.
Good to
Learning some
know.
things from our audience experts. I know a lot of folks out there have a lot more experience with some of these crops, especially in South Dakota, than maybe we
Yeah,
do, since we're
I
not
just
often
know you
here.
want corn to be to have a bunch of corn plants close by each other and want them all to come up at the same time so it pollinates uniform.
Yep. Yeah, they need that wind pollination. Yeah, I spent my time in the sweet corn in Pennsylvania, so I know what that's like. But yeah, it was great to hear from everybody this evening. Thank you to all the attendees that joined us on this beautiful Tuesday night in South Dakota. We will be back again next Tuesday and every Tuesday for the rest of June with more Garden Hour content. So again, if you've got a question in the meantime, feel free to reach out to any of us individually. Throw your question in Ask Extension widget on our Problems and Solutions page, or get in touch with any one of our 4 garden hotlines. So with that, I will sign off and wish you all happy gardening.